What's really fun about this conference and what's enjoyable is the opportunity to hear from people who come from such varied backgrounds. And so I really appreciate the opportunity. I had been actually looking forward to discussing the paper that never came. And when it didn't come, I remember calling Carl and Joe and saying, I'm a finance professor who works on the structure of stock exchanges. I don't actually really kind of know what global and national solidarity is. They assured me that the financial crisis was close enough and suggested I chat about the financial crisis. So I'm actually going to do that. So my talk actually sounds very similar to what you heard in the first section, but I am going to try and pick up on what Stefano talked about a little bit and weave it in. So perhaps we should think about this morning's session as one long session as opposed to two subsessions. So let me offer some thoughts on sort of what I do think we learned from the financial crisis, and maybe or maybe not we can tie them in. And that really does go back to this gap in behavior that we saw. And I think Stefano talked about what happens when the behavior that used to get people thrown out of country clubs seems to get them enshrined in the Business Leaders Hall of Fame. Where did we go wrong? And I think that gap is actually the issue that our first panel spoke about so coherently and so cogently. It raises, I think, a very serious set of issues about the gap between what we see and what we believe, at least as Catholics, you should see. I think one of the other things to notice is that this gap is one that actually doesn't easily get solved by new laws or new structures, right? Very few participants of the financial crisis have gone to jail, right? And that's largely because most of them didn't actually break any laws. So if you have a lot of faith that laws are going to solve this, I'm not entirely sure I agree with you. And I think the reason has always been that there is not a unidimensional congruence between legality and morality. And even in the financial markets, this distinction is known. In law, there's a very famous case here in the US called Meinhard v. Salmon, which introduced the notion of, quote, the morals of the marketplace. It's really a great decision. It was written in 1928. And in that decision, Justice Benjamin Cardozo argued that Salmon owed a greater duty to his counterparty than what was strictly set out in the contract. A greater duty than, quote, simply the morals of the market. And this concept of morals of the market is an interesting one. While fraud is always outlawed, the morals of the market can be loosely interpreted as saying, as long as I do exactly what's in the contract, then I'm fine, right? That if I can take advantage of you, as long as I do what I've stated, then, so far so good. There's a lot of discussion in law about when these greater duties are owed. You, for example, cannot take advantage of widows and orphans even if you want to. Interestingly enough, you're not allowed to take advantage of municipalities either. But it is considered the morals of the market that two sophisticated investors should be able to look out for themselves. I think that's what we discovered in the crisis. That actually didn't quite work. In the crisis, we saw repeated instances with this attitude of, I can take advantage of you if you let me, because that's kind of the morals of the market, prevailed. And this was particularly the case when we talk about complex instruments that were designed and sold to willing but probably over-trusting counterparties. I was willing, to buy these CDOs, in part because I just figured that you wouldn't sell them to me and if they weren't good, and besides, I'm sophisticated. I was involved in a case where a large bank was sold a CDO as a, quote, risk-free alternative to a treasury bond. Yet the security was part of a CDO offering, and unbeknownst to the borrower, the previous 5 CDO offerings put out by this very same issuer were already in default. Of course, by the morals of the market, if you didn't think to ask, I didn't need to tell you. And that's the morals of the market. Now, similarly, the SEC's case against Goldman Sachs and the general outcry against the giant squid, as they've been referred to, said it about what is acceptable behavior in modern markets. To add a globalization theme here, I might note that Greece's financial dilemmas were effectively disguised with the help from Goldman Sachs and others. None of this is probably illegal. But it's surely not what J.P. Morgan meant when he argued that his bankers should do, quote, first-class business in a first-class way. By this I meant the very first J.P. Morgan. Pope Benedict, in Charity and Truth, stated, quote, "It is not the instrument that must be called into account, but individuals, their moral conscience, and their personal and social responsibility." I think on this he has it exactly right. Now, interestingly enough, I wanted to talk a little bit about Adam Smith, but I was going to mention the theory of moral sentiment, so I'm going to go even earlier than our earlier speaker. Smith argued that it was, quote, "the contempt and indignation of society," end quote, that allowed markets to work. And this is the same theme that Joe mentioned the Pope developed when he argued that economic systems rely on trust and a commitment to the common good. This was lacking before and after the crisis, and it's created the Wall Street movement, the general reluctance of individuals to trust markets or banks, and it now is contributing to the challenges we see in Europe. You begin to see people no longer willing to put money into the banks in Portugal and Spain and other places. As trust evolves, so does everything else. The latter point, I think, is extremely important, and it has to do with what happens when you don't have that glue that holds it together. What happens when the morals of the market prevail? And I'll tell you that an interesting aspect of this is to think about the problem more generally. My day job is a finance professor, but I moonlight on the side as chairman of a broker-dealer firm. And one of the things that you can see vividly illustrated in our markets now is that volumes are disappearing. Right? In the United States, in Q1 2009, the average daily volume on the New York Stock Exchange was 3.5 billion shares. In Q1 2012, it was 1.6 billion. The same is true of NASDAQ, where volumes over the period have fallen from 2.7 billion shares a day to 1.2 billion. Why has trading fallen so precipitously when the economy is growing and markets are now recovered? It's that individuals no longer trust the market. Outflows from equity mutual funds in the United States have been negative virtually every month since 2008. People don't want to play anymore. When you lose the trust and the structure, when people don't believe that there is this general globalness that we all believe in, they don't play anymore. And I think that's one of the challenges that has been brought up in the earlier talk, that as we think about sort of the global issues, as the markets begin to fragment away from a belief in a shared concept, right? As we move to a world in which things are globalized, but we don't seem to share the underlying consensus of what works, then we end up in a situation where people won't participate. And you can think about this more generally. As we move to a globalized world, we moved away from loans, which are negotiated face-to-face, to securities, which are anonymous. And when you have a world where you trade securities which are anonymous, you have to rely on what? Legal structures, and you have to rely on analytical structures. And the challenge with both of those is they failed in the crisis. Our legal structures turned out not to be sufficient. Our analytical models didn't really work. The credit rating agencies weren't sufficient, and so it doesn't work. And therein lies, I think, the beginning of the challenge of how do we create what has essentially been, ravaged by the crisis. Yesterday, we heard Cardinal Marx give very thought-out arguments, well-thought-out arguments in favor of the social market economy. A crucial framework of that is a regulatory structure. Since the crisis in the United States, we've seen massive changes to our regulatory structure, from Dodd-Frank to Basel III and so on. Despite these changes, however, there's little evidence they've restored trust in the markets or reduced the contempt and indignation that we now have in markets. And I'm not sure they've changed behavior in any of the ways that they've envisioned by the drafters of those laws. The J.P. Morgan London whale structure demonstrates that a lot of this continues the same way. I think the efforts of governments to regulate away the problem misses the underlying point that was raised back in the theory of moral sentiments, was raised by all of our speakers earlier, and was alluded to by Stephan, that the underlying point that moral behavior comes from the individual. New laws can help remove behavior, but if that isn't illegal in the first place, it doesn't really get you anywhere. Yesterday, Professor Murphy basically spoke of the alternative role played by incentives to try and make everything fit together. I agree these are important. It's very hard to argue against incentives. But again, these incentives are very hard to specify in ways that accomplish what is needed. I think one of the challenges with incentives is that they're great for the short run and they're terrible for the long run. There's a case here in the United States a number of years ago that involved, again, two sophisticated investors, Bankers Trust and Procter & Gamble. Procter & Gamble sued Bankers Trust for selling them a financial contract that it appeared to Bankers Trust, that appeared to Procter & Gamble was unfair, that Procter & Gamble was guaranteed to lose. The interesting part about that case is that it went to the courts and Procter & Gamble lost. Bankers Trust won. But Bankers Trust is gone and Procter & Gamble thrives. And why is Bankers Trust gone? Because no one would deal with Bankers Trust, right? The behavior wasn't illegal, it was not acceptable, right? And that same challenge today comes as we try and regulate our corporations. One of the challenges that you face in corporate structures is how do you incentivize the right behavior? And unfortunately, again, Professor Zingalis mentioned this earlier, I think sometimes we in the academia area, particularly in finance and economics, we don't get it right. We were busy telling corporations to try and create options to incentivize people. Now we're busy telling everybody, don't put the options in, they create too much opportunity for risk. Now you want to give people restricted stock. We haven't quite gotten our stories right. I think this is really the challenge as we think about the crisis, right? What was missing, and the theme I'm developing is very much the theme you heard earlier today, that markets don't work in the absence of something that holds them together. Regulation doesn't necessarily work because much of the things that caused the crisis weren't illegal. Incentives are really hard to make work because the short run and the long run are very, very different. And it is very challenging to put it in place. So what does make it work, right? How do we get to the path that we need to go to? And again, I think here there's an interesting word. We've heard social norms, we've heard all kinds of words. I want to return to the word culture. We often think about culture on a national scale, but I actually think culture in a business setting, every company has a culture. Maybe every business school has a culture, right? Maybe every conference has a culture. I'm not sure. But I do know that the culture is sort of an interesting issue that business leaders work on a lot to try and make sure that what happens in their company may not violate the laws, may not be appropriate with the morals of the market, but it's not what they want done. And therein, I think, lies the challenge. Professor Zingalis made the correct point, I think, that we in business schools have to do more to teach this, and I agree. But as he was saying it, I was thinking that my colleagues who teach organizational behavior would be, turning in their graves at the moment, to coin a phrase, because that's what they claim they teach. That they spend all their time teaching people exactly how should you be thinking about these bigger issues. But I've always thought that part of the challenge there is that it's a little bit like teaching freshmen in college calculus. They learn it, but they have no idea what to do with it, right? Engineers have no trouble with calculus because they see it. I think that's where we are failing as professors of economics, finance, or business leaders. You see the applications, and you can show them where it fits, but we don't, right? So where do I sum up here, all right? This is supposed to be a session on globalization and local solidarity, of which, as you've noted, I know nothing about. But I do think that the theme that we're seeing today developed is that the structure of putting things together, whether it's in markets when you have deals between two people, or it's economic unions that have to somehow all fit together, they rely on something more. Right? They can't just rely on the morals of the market because that doesn't get us there. I think that to sum up, I want to end with another quote from Pope Benedict in Charity and Truth. He wrote, "The market is not and cannot become the place where the strong subdue the weak." I think in the financial crisis that happened and it was a disaster. It may be today we're seeing the same thing happening more globally, that strong countries and weak countries are in a situation where they can't figure out how to share either. And perhaps therein lies the challenge of trying to think about the financial crisis as a financial crisis. It's a much, much deeper problem. Thank you.